Hi, this is just a short, kind of a short test of my video to see if everything is coming out okay. Let me know. I want to give you a real quick breakdown of the scriptures. Uh, like I said, I'm going to be starting a video lessons. I'm waiting to get a cord for my camera, which is right here. And this is a high definition camera, so you can see. Okay, I got to get a cord that will go to my laptop, to my camera, so I can make a proper video that's a lot better. But to break it down, the scriptures really is not that hard to understand, the teachings, but we got to know which covenants we're teaching it from. Now, we have the patriarchal covenant, we have the Mosaical covenant, and then we have what the forefathers call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the scriptures call it the fullness of time, Galatians 4:4. So instead of saying Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I want to call it the fullness of time, because that's what it was. It was a fullness of time. Now, uh, people are teaching that Malachi was the last Old Testament prophet, and that uh, Jesus' birth and his ministry is the New Testament. That's not true. That's false. I will show you that from the death of Christ until Acts chapter 2, the time between the end of the Old Covenant and the beginning of the New Covenant was not 450 years, but it was 50 days from the death of Christ until Acts 2. That's what the scriptures teach. Okay? Now, when Jesus died, he was buried, and then he rose the third day. He showed himself alive to his 11 apostles. And he told his 11 apostles at his resurrection that he says, don't you remember while I was yet with you that I told you that all things had to be fulfilled which was written about me in the law of Moses and in the prophets concerning me. Then he opened up the 11 apostles' minds to the scriptures. See, from Genesis to the fullness of time, there was the prophecy to Israel that a king would come to Israel, that a Messiah, the anointed one, a great mighty prophet will come to Israel. Jesus fulfilled it in the fullness of time. Okay? You have an empty glass. Okay? It's an empty glass until you fill it up. That's what Jesus did. He fulfilled everything that was written about him in the fullness of time. The forefathers call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? Then Jesus took that old covenant religion, that old covenant that God had with his chosen people, the Jewish people of Israel, and he took it away. When he opened up the minds of the apostles in his resurrection, he therefore turned around and he told the apostles that they were going to take the gospel of his death, burial, and resurrection, where they were witnesses of. They were to go to Jerusalem and wait until the promise of the Father, that's the Holy Spirit. And then they were to preach the gospel of the death, burial, and resurrection. And that was Acts chapter 2, when Peter preached the gospel for the first time. There's your timeline. From the death of Christ until Acts chapter 2 was 50 days. During the 40 days that Jesus was with his 11 apostles after his resurrection, there was no salvation. All Jews were alienated from God. And of course, Gentiles were already alienated from God long before, because they weren't part of Israel. They were a lost nation. But Jesus opened the door through the gospel of his death, burial, and resurrection to all people. Now, Jesus' earthly ministry is silent from Acts 2 to Revelations 22, and it was meant to be silent because Jesus taught, lived, and died under the law that he took away. He fulfilled everything that was written about him. Now, when Jesus was in his earthly ministry, Jesus, being a prophet, would prophesy ahead to the new covenant, but he never taught the new covenant. His prophecies are fulfilled through the apostles. So for us today, Christ's teachings for us today would come in the last days, and that would be Acts chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 1 verses 2 says, in the last days the message of Christ would come to us. That's when the new covenant started, was Acts chapter 2, and it was through the death, burial, and resurrection. Okay? So Jesus' earthly ministry was kept silent by the apostles because it was under the law at that time. Now, we had two sets of people. Okay? We had the Jews that used to be in covenant with God, Judaism, and then we got the Gentiles who were a lost nation. Now, through the gospel, the death of Christ broke down that middle wall that was between the Gentiles and the Jews. He broke the wall down. He took the law away to the Jews, and it ushered in the Gentiles. So he made the two, Jew and Gentile, one, Christian. Now the Jews from Acts 2 to Revelations 22 could not accept the idea that Jesus took their old religion away. And they were really mad that now the Gentiles were going to be fellow citizens of the Jews. They didn't like that. But the Apostle Paul told us Christians that we're not to remember Christ in the flesh. Actually, he was telling the Jewish Christians in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 16, yeah, we may have known Christ in the flesh, but henceforth we remember him no more in the flesh. And that was only to the Jews. Every time you hear the apostles speak to the men of Israel, it was always the Jews. The apostles would remind them of their past and then tell them the present. You used to be this way, but now you're this way through the gospel. But some of these Jews, a lot of these Jews would drift back into the law. Okay? So the apostles would continuously remind them that they're no longer under the law. Read Acts 10 when Peter preached to the first Gentile convert. Peter himself actually went back to Leviticus 11. And God reminded Peter he's no longer under that Old Testament anymore. Read it, Acts chapter 10. We are in the new covenant of Christ's will. Before the cross, God was in authority on heaven and on earth. But in the new covenant, Christ broke the powers of death, and he was declared the Son of God through his resurrections, Romans chapter 1 verse 8. all power and authority has been given to Jesus. Now Jesus is king of the throne. Acts 2 to Revelations 22 is his will for us today. Not the fullness of time, but Acts 2, Revelations 22. The scriptures don't lie. Men lie. We're not to follow man's tradition. We are to stay in the first century teachings. We're not to go beyond what the apostles taught. When Paul says that we're to hold the traditions of the apostles, that's exactly what he means. But today, it's not like that. Today, they're following the tradition of the forefathers. When they bring those books into the new covenant, that's wrong. The apostles didn't do it, and neither should we. So, okay, let me know what you think about this video. Leave a comment. Let me know. And like I said, when I get the cord to my new camcorder, then I'll be able to start better videos, better quality. Alright, thank you so much.